And I thought I'd really get us kicking by starting to talk about the law. Whoa! However, it is important that the last 18 months have seen the biggest change in the legal landscape for customer data around, particularly around digital, that we've seen at least in the last 20 years and possibly in relation to digital ever. Everyone knows about GDPR, fewer people know about some of the others, but the point is that this has sort of evolved over the last couple of years. And it's really vital that we as a customer analytics and insight industry really get to grips with these changes, because to be honest, we've taken for granted how we collect data for so long that some of these new regulatory changes are really going to start to challenge us. And so we need to understand what the downsides are, but also look at the opportunities. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about consent, I'm going to talk about compliance, and I'm going to talk about the opportunities around how this can impact customer experience and digital customer experience in particular. For those of you who haven't met yet, my name is David Ellis. I am Managing Director of Station 10. Station 10 is a data science consultancy specialising particularly in digital and multi-channel environments and delivering customer insight through that. Station 10 was the code name for Bletchley Park, so we aspire to be even a fraction of the original data scientists that were there. I'm not aspiring to be, I'm not saying I'm Alan Turing or anything, but you know, if we can aspire to be something like that. And we provide services right from data strategy and planning, implementation, deep dive insights and data science, customer activation and optimization, how you start to really deliver that value from that insight, and also data academy, so we train that to embed that into organizations. And we do it for some people like that. The point being that we've kind of got a lot of experience in this area, so we can talk a lot around it. Now let's start with compliance. The ICO. Who's heard of the ICO? The Information Commissioner's Office, who are the regulators in the UK. It's good that you know. It's an interesting, fascinating saga, the ICO story at the moment, which, to be honest, reflects kind of the industry as a whole. Over the summer, the ICO admitted that they had actually broken their own rules on their own website about how they've been implementing cookies, quite when they're going to take themselves to court, and quite what the fine they might levy upon themselves. I don't know, I'm not privy to those conversations. But nonetheless, fines there are. There have been some fairly significant ones in the last year. I suspect most people here have heard of these. So the British Airways last summer had data being sent to a malicious server somewhere else through a bit of code that had been injected into their site, placed on there, and they got fined a fairly significant amount. Marriott, has anyone heard of the Marriott scenario, where actually it was a company called Starwood that they bought that had been in breach for quite some time, and they continued to be in breach after they had, after that Marriott had bought Starwood. So actually, Marriott were effectively fined for not doing enough due diligence. But the point is, this has now captured
there's
the
something I can start whenever I want to. I guess I'll get started then. Hi, everyone.
Can you hear me still? No. Julian? Can you hear me now? Yeah? Can you hear me at the back? No. Okay. Right, we'll do it this way. Can everyone hear me now? Jolly good. Thank you very much. So anyway, that slide took longer than I thought. The point is that this is now really capturing the interest of the board and the CEOs of organisations everywhere. In terms of the sort of the malicious types of hacks, lots of people have focused on the top two sources, as it were, of a hack. You've got the hack of your own code, a bit like the British Airways example. There's also the hack of a supplier's code, which is also possible, of course. But then there's also the user related shenanigans, as we put it. So a disgruntled employee or someone who might be on the inside and putting things in. Precisely what the details are, but they probably relate more to those particular fines that we were just talking about. Certainly the Marriott example seems to be around process and how it wasn't managed very well. So there is definitely more likelihood, I think, around the user-related shenanigans to be a challenge in this area than perhaps the hacks that everyone keeps focusing on. The good news, though, is that there are 4 things you can do fairly easily to start mitigating the risk around compliance. Firstly, you can start doing regular user management reviews, so you can make sure who has access to your data, who has access to the tools. I'm imagining most people are doing that already. Yeah, excellent. You can also put really good governance around your testing of your code before it goes live. Again, I'm assuming most people are doing that. You can also do regular auditing of the cookies that are on your site. There are good tools around that. You can, again, fewer nods this time, but that is something you can also put in place. And also there are increasingly sophisticated marketing security MarSec tools you can put in place, which can start to whitelist the sites that you might be sharing data with, so you can then prevent hacks and things like that from ever actually taking place because they're whitelisted or blacklisted accordingly. So there are the technology starting to emerge as well, which you can also look to put in place. So there are these 4 things which can start to really significantly mitigate your risk around compliance. Am I still close enough to the mic? I can't quite tell. Is that all right? Great. Thank you very much. So that kind of focuses on the, if you like, the IT side of things, but what are the risks for marketers? These are a couple of statements that might be myths or they might be facts. Who knows? Firstly, analytics cookies are strictly necessary, so we don't need consent. Anyone who thinks that? Jolly good, well done. Correct. The guidance is very clear now from the ICO that analytics cookies are not essential, so they therefore do need consent. And secondly, I suspect you're not going to fall into this trap either, so I might as well just get on with it. So that you also can't rely on legitimate interest to set cookies. PECA says you have to get consent to set cookies. The way in which you use the data might have legitimate interest related to it, but you have to get consent to set cookies other than essential ones. Which is interesting. Because the way we've been doing things for the last 20, 25 years around the digital customer experience has been based on things like cookies and technology like that. And suddenly we're getting hemmed in from both sides, if you like. There's the legislative stuff we've just been talking about, but also there's increasingly technical constraints which are being brought in primarily by the browsers. And so you have what you could call the cookie corral, where things are getting hemmed in from either side. Why is that happening? One of the early drafts of the PECA 2 spoke about how the browsers were going to become the policemen of the internet, and everyone joked saying, well, that's not possible. How are they going to do that? And actually, what is happening is that the browsers have started doing that anyway, because it's all about privacy and how they can be the best for their consumers. So actually, although it's not actually in place, the PECA 2 won't be in place probably for 18 months or so, the browsers are already acting as the policemen of the internet, and they're starting to penalise cookies that are set in the wrong way, code on websites that are set in the wrong way to prevent cookie fraud, for instance. So now, Safari, again, I'm assuming most people in the room know this, but Safari now delete incorrect or third-party cookies after a day. Is everyone aware of that? And Mozilla is deleting them after a week. And even Chrome, which is obviously part of Google, and therefore Google makes quite a lot of money about targeting customers around the internet. Even Chrome is looking at introducing limitations early next year. So this is a significant trend that's taking place that we do need to make sure it's happening. It's not just the legal side of things, it's also the technical side of things. Okay, so that's enough compliance for one day. So let's start talking about consent. Now, I just wanted to show you this. This is the technical definition of consent according to the legislation. And the key thing, I can't quite do it without moving away. You can see that the key points here are that it's freely given, specific, informed and unambiguous. They're the key points that we need to make sure we're doing. And to be honest, as we said at the beginning, we haven't really been doing that for the best part of 20 years. We've been taking a lot of the data collection here pretty much as for granted. And I'd like to show, by way of demonstrating that point, I'd like you to watch a little clip which you might find amusing.
Why am I mentioning all of this?
Listen,
Partly because that expansion is going to accelerate. There is a lot more interest from the user experience community now.
Can you hear that? We might be getting some. We might have a minor technical challenge here on the audio.
They're supposed to cut the audio from the stream and they haven't. Sorry, give me 1 sec. Yeah, so they were supposed to cut that. So if you click on that in 2 seconds.
We tested it earlier. It's working perfectly. Right, let's give it a go.
Hey, bro! Listen, I was trying to buy this handcrafted mahogany wood model of a B-25 Mitchell Panchito aircraft.
Aw, for me?
Don't sass me. And I went to this website and this ad popped up that said, "Hey, Ron Swanson, check out this great offer."
What's your question?
My question is, what the hell?
Like, how do they know who you are?
Yeah.
Okay. There are these things called cookies, where, like, if you go to a site and buy something, it'll remember you and then create ads for other stuff you might want to buy.
So it learns information about me? Seems like an invasion of privacy.
Dude, if you think that's bad, go to Google Earth and type in your address.
That's effectively what we as an industry have been doing for the last 20 years. We've been expecting that consumers out there will just willingly accept our ability to, as Ron puts it, invade their privacy. And that's what both these legislation and the technical limitations are starting to challenge. We can't behave like that any longer, and we need to start, as an industry, behaving differently because, that is just too familiar for words, isn't it? Now, the challenge, of course, on that is what happens if we do start asking people for consent. Do we start getting significant dropout in terms of our acceptance rates? Well, this is taken from very soon after the GDPR legislation went live. There are surprisingly few metrics around this publicly available still, but you can see here that actually the number of people who are accepting it is way, way lower than you would, as a marketeer, like that to be. So there is a challenge around this. Now, the one thing I would say in response to this is we've been putting in some of our cookie consent tools for our clients. We're starting to see that maybe those acceptance rates are maybe a bit better than that, and maybe less of a challenge. But it's really important that you start to understand and measure the acceptance rates that you're getting across your websites, because that could well be the scenario we have in the future. And it's really about building trust. So this again is from a couple of years ago, but this won't have changed very much. 70% of consumers don't feel like they are getting fair value exchange from organisations who are asking for their data. And that really is the opportunity. The opportunity here isn't to focus on the negative, which admittedly I have done for the last 15 minutes, but to start focusing on the opportunity that we have and to really focus on that value exchange. Now, I apologise, the Christmas ads have started, so this doesn't feel quite so irrelevant, but that's not why Santa's up here. To my mind, Santa is the most effective and longest lasting value exchange brand out there. If you think about what Father Christmas offers, it is, if you believe in me, I will give you gifts. And that even happens for people who fundamentally don't believe in Father Christmas. It still works. Now, it's all about the value exchange. And that, in that scenario, is a fair one. People are happy to suspend their disbelief in order to get presents. I'm sorry if there are any children watching, by the way. I'm sorry about that. But it's really about establishing what your data proposition is, communicating it well, and broadcasting that, and really making sure you're emphasising the value that you are delivering to your user. Now, as an example, I don't know how much you can see that. This is something I saw a couple of weeks ago. This is National Rail on their app, and it talks about the data there. You know, the first bit sounds, well, that's scary, you're spying on me. The second bit starts talking about, well, use the information to inform platform and crowd control, carriage crowding, beg your pardon. Now that's a really interesting value exchange. That's something I would like to know, so I don't try and cram myself onto another massively crowded train. I can go a bit further down. On that basis, I'm willing to share my data. I think that's very interesting. We also don't have to ask for consent all at the same time. There's a lot of talk about cookie walls, that you go into an area and then you have to consent. I'd like to think of it more of a cookie staircase. So, which is, how do you encourage people along the way? They don't have to get consent right at the beginning. If you're asking customers to sign in later on, you can then ask them there. An interesting one, actually, again on the train, where I realised that the Wi-Fi I'd been having to log in on a daily basis for the last year, actually, if I gave my data, they would log me in permanently. Fair value exchange, I think. So I think and that's been a year happening. So I think there are interesting ways in which you can encourage people along their data sharing journey as they go through. And it's also an opportunity to be data ethical about this. This is probably going to be a very common phrase you're going to hear, but it is an opportunity to build a competitive advantage through data ethics. If you're going to ask for your customers' data, explain how you're going to use it, be transparent about it. And actually, you will probably find that people are quite interested and will see the value in the services that you're offering them. If you're going to plan to use their data without consent, you need to be, again, transparent about that. There might, there are legitimate interests you can have, but you should be explaining those. But build a really compelling customer proposition and be transparent. And I think you'll then start to see you can build a really powerful competitive advantage, not just keep up with the Joneses, as it were. There's another few thoughts that you can consider as well. So as part of that process, know where your data's flowing. So do you have the correct level of consent to share with the other partners that you might be sharing it with? Are you sharing it with an RTB platform? Have you got the consent for that? How's that going to work? Are you sharing it with your marketing agencies? Have you made sure that that's clear and explained who these people are, who your agencies are, and how they're going to be using that data? Because if you're asking if they need consent further down the line, it's going to be a bit more tricky to get hold of. So you need to make sure you're being clear as far as you can up front. Another fairly perhaps obvious point, but with cookies potentially getting deleted a lot more, you can't really rely on some of the key digital metrics that you might have been relying on. So visitors, for instance, is a metric which is effectively useless from now on. So you need to start thinking about how you change your KPIs. Visits or sessions is still going to be absolutely relevant, and you can use those, but that's the way you start thinking about it. As I say, cookie acceptance rates becomes a really important consideration. The proportion of consented users that you've got on your site and what they're doing, and if you're coming through to these cookie staircases, consent staircases, what are you, how many are you taking through that customer journey? So I think there is a real question here about how we're going to define the right metrics for our digital and marketing operations for the future to encompass this new world that we're in. Again, this might be fairly obvious, but move to first-party cookies if you can for your digital operations. This doesn't get around the consent challenge, but it does start to limit the number of times you might have cookie deletion issues. It's clearly best practice anyway, and it's going to get more difficult if you've got a multi-domain customer experience. But for those others than that, it's going to be easier. I'm not going to start talking about digital advertising because we haven't got time. We've only got half an hour. Yeah, that's a different conversation. If you want to talk about that, maybe come and find us afterwards. And then this is interesting because I don't think we'd have been having this conversation a year ago. You might start considering server-side tracking technology. What does that mean? It means that you start collecting the data on your own server rather than out in the cloud, as it were, with a third party. Again, it doesn't remove the consent obligation, but it does limit the technical browser deletion challenges, because it's obviously that is the most secure, that is the guaranteed way of making sure that the data isn't going anywhere else. The challenge is it's a bit of a sledgehammer approach at the moment, because the browsers are basically don't have this concept of a friendly third-party cookie any longer. That's sort of fallen by the wayside. So there is a interest perhaps or consideration around looking into server-side. The challenge is, I think the ICO were asked why they were interested in driving server-side more, and their answer was, well, I just think you should be looking at log files. Now, looking around the room, there's not that many of you who are probably old enough to be doing digital analytics in 1999, but that's basically what we were doing 25 years ago. And it does feel like that's the area where this is sort of out of step with the current trends. It feels a little bit not like Back to the Future, perhaps Back to the Past. These technologies have significant implications for your entire organisation. So it goes away from the trend towards the cloud. I think generally things are moving towards the cloud. If you're then starting to put things into your own server, that's sort of against that. You're then having to manage your own servers, pay for them. You know, that's a challenge, and you're probably also talking to different suppliers as well. So it's not a straightforward consideration. It's not a question of just ripping out what you've already got and putting something else in. It's quite a significant impact on the wider ecosystem of your business. So I wouldn't rush into that particular one at the moment. I'd maybe consider that. And then just to conclude, what we are now is that we used to have a little bit of information about a lot of people. Now we're in a world where we are looking to get a lot of information about fewer people, because we're going to get fewer amounts of consent. And so we need to start working out ways of diving deeper into the data that we do have. Now, one thing I haven't seen that much of is how you can start sharing consent across devices. Now, that suddenly becomes a data value exchange proposition that your consumers, I would love that, but very few people are offering that as an opportunity. And I do think this is an area where it benefits both parties. It benefits the consumer because it allows you to stay logged in, or to have your preferences kept across from different places. It also helps the marketeer and the analyst to understand those customers better. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity that I think very few people are offering as a value exchange around sharing their data. So I do think that's a really interesting opportunity. That's something that I'd suggest people could start looking into. So, yeah, that's the main points really. So we've covered the areas of consent, we've covered compliance and the legal stuff, but also, and I really want to sort of emphasise this at the end, there are fantastic opportunities to develop and deliver fantastic customer experiences across all of your channels in the future, and we shouldn't be regarding the new, if you like, limitations as a negative. This is a real opportunity to build a data ethical approach and environment for our customers and consumers. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.